So the book title here, The Party Crasher, How Jesus Disrupts Politics as Usual and Redeems Our Partisan Divide.
Right.
Gosh, you really chose a fiery topic during a fiery season, didn't you?
Yeah, a very lighthearted topic. Nothing controversial here.
Nothing controversial. But let's start. We're going to get into the book, but what drives you the most crazy or concerns you, because I don't want to put words in your mouth, about how some Christians today handle politics?
Definitely. Well, so a little background. So I've been a pastor for a little over 20 years, and the last two election seasons, just seeing the fracturing and division where we all feel it. The political divide is wider than ever, but seeing it fracture families and friendships and even churches. So I share a story in the opening of the book of just a church we were really close with, good friends with, and our network, and they split in half, like 1,500 out of 3,000 people left. And over what seemed to me relatively small, it was one of the pastors put a video on Instagram, kind of, trying to offer some thoughts, shepherd's people that seemed pretty tame from where I was at, but for about 8 people in the church, they kind of read it through a particular grid and basically left the church angry and started a campaign to take down the church. We're unwilling to meet to kind of process through things. So they started coffee shop conversations with friends, like, oh, this is why this church is going the wrong way. They started gossip and slander, just rumors that were flat out not true about where this church was sending their money and all. And basically, though, where they started scouring every pastor in the network, all of our sermons, looking for ammunition, and then every pastor and their spouse's social media feeds, just looking for anything to take down in the church. And it worked. So much of what the rumors that spread and gossip and whatever was just not true. But within a few months, like 1,500 out of 3,000 people left angry, and it kind of split the church, and that kind of stuff made me upset. That drove me, that kind of thing drives me crazy. And I wish I could say that was just a one-off story, but being friends with people, pastors around the nation, knowing that is actually happened a lot. I was just talking last week with a friend who's a pastor here in Portland. That story was in Arizona, but here in Portland, where the same thing happened back during the last election season. So the heart behind the book was, man, that kind of thing drives me crazy, and we're seeing it fracture families, again, and friendships as well. And so wanting to trying to offer some resources and things that I found helpful and our church used that was really helpful to go, how do we navigate the political season, this election season, without necessarily, letting it divide us in those unhealthy kind of ways?
Yeah. I mean, so you've been a pastor for a long time. What is your posture on the I'm just curious on the how do you approach this? Do people know how you're going to vote? Do they not know how you're going to vote? Do you sort of back away from getting too in the weeds on the actual pulling the lever or filling in? It's changed now, but how we vote, how do you deal with that in terms of your own voting?
Great question. Well, I do talk about in the book that there are, 5 areas that, okay, so for myself personally, my son, I got 3 kids, and one of them, my middle son, he's 10, and he's always like, Dad, who are you voting for? And I don't tell him, because I know he's going to go tell everybody. And, and I think, like, as a pastor like that, I'm okay with some people approach that differently, but for me, I do want to disciple our people in the values of the kingdom. And often when it comes to issues, I do talk in the book about a number of specific issues where I think these are places to be bold on, to plant a flag, to take a stand against where our culture is at. But when it comes to voting for particular candidates, I try and hold my own cards a little close to the chest, just because often, we've got a mix of people so when I was in Arizona, we were in a college town. And so about half the congregation leaned left because they were university students. They're young, 20s, trying to figure things out at the university. You've got professors, college, people who just demographically our city would lean up. But then we were right on the border of Gilbert and Chandler, which were stark, very, very red, leaned right. And all those folks were in the congregation together, about 50-50. And so I found, like, trying to create an environment where we're Jesus first, discipleship, and then hoping to cultivate the values that can get people to what I think would be a biblical vision for those things. But when I come right out of the gate and throw my cards on the table with here's who I'm voting for, I think it can shut down some of the discipleship process, some of the deeper foundational work that needs to happen to help people get there. And now back in Portland, where I'm from, shepherding here, where the same kind of deal. So I tend to hold my own cards close to the chest in terms of candidates, but I do try and disciple in terms of what I think some of the values that Jesus and God's kingdom brings that should shape and inform how we vote.
Well, and that's so it's so interesting to me, and we'll get into the book here in a second, but the way I look at things is issues are really important, right? And so I tend to look at issues, but I know a lot of people tend to look at personality, and we've seen this again and again. I mean, in polling years ago, I used to work for a polling firm, and we would ask the question, which candidate would you rather have a beer with? And the way that the public would respond to that, it had to do really with the personality of the person. And so I'm interacting with a lot of people now, and there's a real tension there. Some people are saying, well, I'm willing to look past personality because the issues matter so much. And there are a lot of people willing to look past certain issues because the personality matters so much. And that, I don't remember that dynamic being this intense, right? Where you actually
Yes.
have that much of a split. I don't know if you want to react to that at all, but it's interesting.
That totally. No, it is very interesting. And I do think too, like no, I think you're spot on, that's so true. And also I find, when it comes to, and I should say, personally, I do think that character matters in leaders, but as I look at
Sure.
some of the options and stuff, and often I think we're thinking of the presidential national election, but even, I talk about in the book about even focusing locally, like city council in our city and what are some of the positions and the things that we can do locally. And I do think that character matters, which is a little different than personality and kind of our celebrity culture, where you can be driven by kind of like, okay, they've got a magnetic, charismatic personality, but behind the scenes, they're, whether the issues and their policies or even their character seems off, and I do think that, when it comes to some of the bigger national stuff, I think many people today, we find ourselves frustrated with going, I don't know that I'm stoked on the personality or character of either option, but this is kind of where we're at. And yet I do think that as followers of Jesus, elevating that bar of like, man, our hope would be for both character in leaders and in integrity in the issues and how we,
Absolutely.
how
So
we're moving
let me
that
ask
way.
you this, because I know this is something you deal with in the book. How is politics today mirroring religion, and even for some people, potentially replacing it or taking a higher precedence over it?
Totally. So I talk in the first chapter about like what I call the four political religions. And for many people, I think when you hear the word, political religions, aren't you mixing categories? Like religion's one area and politics is another. But historically, the root of the term religion actually had to do with devotion, like what you were most devoted to, and devotion and the social obligations and expectations that came with that devotion. And I would argue that for many people today, there's no greater devotion or zeal that they're showing than to their political ideology, And so I think that there's a religious nature to it. And so I walk in the opening chapter through what I call kind of the four political religions and how these are, taking on like an increasingly religious nature. And I could describe those if we want for for a few
Sure.
minutes.
Yeah. No, I would love for you to. I was gonna have you
Yeah,
do that. So it'd be good to hear you kind
great.
of break those down.
Okay, so the four political religions. Now, big idea here. We often think left, right, and that's true. But I argue that there's also a top-down axis of modernity to post-modernity that has kind of split what we think of as the traditional left and right. And so, on the upper left, if you can kind of think of these as four quadrants, right? So top, left, right axis and a top-down axis. And if we go to the upper left, kind of start there, which is the modern left, I call this the religion of progress with a creed of we can change the world. And so here, think of like Silicon Valley, Google, Facebook, Steve Jobs, there's a faith in scientific discovery, in technological advancement, in building strong institutions and higher education and research, public policy. And historically, I think the high priests of this quadrant were folks like Bill Gates, the Clinton Foundation. They're rallying the faithful towards progress. We can change the world by doing these things, leveraging science, technology, institutions. The worship leader I suggest in this quadrant is maybe Bono, right? Who I love Bono, right? He's kind of rallying the faithful towards, we can change the world and build a better future. Apologists in this quadrant would be, if people are familiar, listeners are familiar, people like Steven Pinker and Sam Harris, who are defending the ascendance of our civilization through science, through reason. Sacred texts here are things like CNN, New York Times, NPR. The temple in this quadrant would be like the university, and particularly the STEM department, where science, technology, engineering, mathematics, STEM, where the laity can kind of advance and ascend the ranks to mediate this transcendent progress to the world. And so that's like kind of the modern left. The modern right, as I call it, is the religion of responsibility, where here the creed is pull yourself up by your bootstraps. We can think here of like this religion being more prominent in the suburbs and Wall Street, where there's a strong faith in personal potential and hard work and good moral values and taking responsibility for yourself and those closest to you, the free market, business entrepreneurship. I think the high priest in this quadrant, historically, when I was growing up, was maybe Ronald Reagan, right? Milton Friedman was sort of the classic economic apologist here. Newt Gingrich, the Public Herald. But today I'd suggest the baton has been passed to figures like Jordan Peterson, where saying, man, if you want to change the world, you start by making your bed. Take responsibility for yourself and your own sphere first. We can see it in figures like Jocko Willink and David Goggin, folks are familiar, who are guiding novices. They talk a lot about extreme ownership as kind of the big theme, and guiding novices into these values and virtues. And the sacred texts here would be more like Fox News, the Wall Street Journal, Daily Wire. And the temple, it's just in this one, is the home with the white picket fence, right? Like it's kind of if the one was the university, modern left, modern right, it's more, here's the reward for those who have been faithful to live out their responsibility in the world. And I should say, when I'm talking about these four quadrants, I'm not trying to critique them at this point, just trying to describe lay of the land, right? Like where we're at. And when I was growing up, those seemed to be the two predominant options. But now, if we move to the lower quadrants, the postmodern quadrants, it might be helpful for me to first say, okay, what do I mean by modernity to postmodernity? And if modernity, if any philosophy majors watching right now are probably going to slap me for how simplistic I'm about to be, But you think of modernity as like the scientists, they're in a lab coat with a microscope, and there was a strong belief in reason and science and technology and institutions and changing the world through these things. We can solve the world's problems. It was very optimistic about human potential here. But postmodernity is a reactionary movement against modernity that saw a lot of modernity's failures. We see things like world wars and nuclear weapons. We see evil things like eugenics that were done in the name of science and progress. And so there's this reaction. And I think we can think of the lower quadrant, the visual stereotype might be an artist painting a picture of themselves as the artist. There's a strong emphasis on looking within. We no longer trust looking out there. And so now we need to look closer to home within to change things. And so postmodernity, if modernity was about discovering and defining the world, postmodernity is more about constructing and creating one's own world. So how does this play out in the political religions, right? Okay, well, the lower left quadrant, this would be like the postmodern left, I refer to as the religion of identity, where here the creed is live your truth. Like, don't anybody tell you how to live your life, like you do you. And we can think this religion is most prominent in like the urban core. And we can think of San Francisco and Boston, figures like Ta-Nehisi Coates and Elliot Page, the race and gender yard signs that are all around in Portland, here where I live, right? Protests against the legacy of injustice, TikTok and Instagram posts with an ethos of self-expression. And what makes this quadrant postmodern is it's very pessimistic towards the ideas and institutions of modernity. Like it still wants to change the world like the upper left, but it no longer trusts those institutions and science things to get us there. And so now there's an emphasis on looking within and discovering and expressing one's most authentic desires. And I think this one is prominent with, think of preachers here in this quadrant as being like pop icons, like Lady Gaga and Lil Nas X, who are modeling this way of salvation for the masses through performative self-expression, continual reinvention. We think of prophets as figures like political leaders like Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, who proclaims this gospel or good news that the world will be saved by deconstructing and dismantling all the institutional roadblocks that keep people from being their authentic selves. And the temple in this one would maybe be the protest, right? If you got the university, the white picket fence in the upper quadrants, here the protest where the vox populi, kind of the voice of the people, can register their disillusionment with the establishment and all demand change. And anyways, I go into more detail in the book, but if we go into the lower right quadrant, I call this the religion of security, where the creed here is good fences make good neighbors. And there's a sense here in this quadrant of like, we live in a dangerous world. We need boundaries, borders to keep people safe. Security allows us to prosper. Insiders in this quadrant, we share codes of conduct with rules of behavior for how we live together. And we should display thick bonds of loyalty to insiders, those who are with us. And we should be wary of outsiders who can threaten our way of life. And so I think in this quadrant, we can think of places like the heartland left behind by the coastal economic booms, right? We can think of figures like Tucker Carlson or Sarah Palin. We can think of Detroit and job ships overseas. We think of the decline of manufacturing and Appalachia and the epidemic of meth addiction and unemployment. And this quadrant is postmodern in the sense that it is also very suspicious and skeptical of the ideas and institutions of modernity. And so there's often rhetoric of the deep state government wants to take away your rights. Big pharma medicine, it's pushing its pills and its vaccines. The fake news media is out to deceive you. The elites are out to get you. So we need to be on guard against those things. And again, not trying to be critical of these quadrants at this stage, just trying to say, hey, there's this ideological.
This is what they are.
Direction. Totally.
Right.
As just, the high priest in this quadrant, probably Donald Trump, and whatever people think of him, for good or for bad, we can think of his most viral campaign slogans tap into this quadrant's language, right? Like, so build the wall, spoke to a desire for security in the context of borders and immigration. Drain the swamp speaks to it, spoke to a deep suspicion of elites and institutions. Make America Great Again speaks to a patriotic nationalism in the face of globalization. And so each speaks kind of a loyalty to us first. And in this quadrant, I suggest the temple is perhaps the nation itself, where there are heretics within the nation who need to be kind of shamed and called back to the ancient paths. There are corrupt leaders above who need to be overthrown for defiling the sanctuary in DC. There are hostile invaders at the gate who need to be repelled. We need stronger enforcement of our sacred borders. And I think every quadrant, I think generally most Americans agree immigration reform is desperately needed, but I think it helps explain, security helps explain why that particularly resonates as an issue with this quadrant in particular. And so in sum, the beauty of the gospel, I suggest, is all four of these values we see, like in the Garden of Eden, for example, we see progress and responsibility, identity and security. But I would suggest when any of them gets uprooted out of God's creational design, it becomes ultimate. It can become an idolatry and an ideology that actually can lead to havoc and destruction. And so I try to play out in the book about how all four of these have some good to bring to the table, but also have dangers when we're not bringing them under the authority of Christ and his kingdom. And so the invitation then is to bring, anyways, I'll stop there.
No, that was that was really helpful, because I think, as people are listening, there's going to be things, they heard names, they heard things that they either liked or didn't like. And, all four of those, when you take the gospel and remove it from the center, as you were saying, what you end up with is sort of this chaotic situation where we have people in all these different quadrants right now vying for power. And let me get a reflection from you on this, because one of the challenges is we are in an intense election year. We have two candidates that nobody seems particularly excited about. I guess there are some people who are excited, but the reality is the country as a whole, I think, is sort of looking at this and saying, okay, interesting. What are we going to do with this? And so you've got a lot of fighting and a lot of debate going on with that. How do Christians engage in politics in a way that is healthy, that balances both truth and speaking truth, also with being peacemakers and doing the other things that we're called to do? So how do we find that balance?
Great. That's excellent. Well, the tagline I have in the book, for this is like to bring your lean, but submit your bow, right? And what I mean by that is bring your political leaning to the table of Christ and his kingdom and the church, because we all have a leaning. I know some folks who lean progress, responsibility, identity, security, and going, there are gifts and insights that I think each of those leanings, those perspectives, those traits have to bring, and things that are good that we see biblically related to that. But to not only bring our lean, but to submit our bow. And if our lean is our kind of perspective and experience, our bow is our ultimate allegiance, and I think it's our ultimate allegiance to Jesus that can keep us with humility and at the table together, and as curious learners who are pressing in together, as the body of Christ. And so I give a lot of the book is trying to give practical, hey, here's how we can do this. One of those things I talk about is the 10 political commandments, that's what I call them. And we used this in the 2020 election season, which was, we kind of jokingly referred to them as the 10 political commandments. So we didn't want it to get confused with the actual 10 commandments, that God gives Moses at Sinai. But going, these are all things that God commands us in Scripture for how we're to live as His people. And these 10 political commandments, they're not so much about who to vote or what issues. I talk about that in other parts of the book. This is more about how to engage, the kind of posture that Jesus calls us to as His people. And so this is not about what opinions to hold, but rather about how to hold them well. And so to give an example, the first commandment is worship, saying, I commit my allegiance to King Jesus over all idols and ideologies, meaning I have my political preference, but I'm going to put Jesus first in terms of what I'm ultimately oriented, not some pundit over here, or not, more ultimate than any of the podcasts I listen to or the pundits listen to. Like I'm seeking to put Jesus first in worship. And second is love of neighbor, saying I commit to participating in civic life as a means of loving and serving my neighbor rather than just serving my own interests. Going, okay, Jesus called us to love God and love others first, top 2 commandments. And so I want to let that orient my political posture. It's not like that. It's just kind of, that's okay over here in your church life, but not out here in the quote unquote real world. Some people say, no, Jesus is Lord over all of life. All of life belongs to Jesus. And so I want to worship Christ and I want to love my neighbor at the heart of how I'm engaging. Some of the other commandments in here talk about like the image of God, treating people with respect and dignity, biblical wisdom, fruitful speech, biblical justice, peacemaking, removing the log, humble learning, loving enemies. There's actually a free download of those 10 commandments on my website if people want to go and download that, check that out. But the goal, the people in our church found that so helpful. They said, we kind of signed on, all of us signed on. We invited people and hundreds of people signed on. It just gave some clarity and guidelines to go in how we interact with folks online, how we talk about these things with one another in the church, just calling ourselves to a posture of humility, of fruitful speech, going, man, the fruit of the Spirit is love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness. I want to embody those things in how I talk about politics in this season, even when I disagree and even when I want to push on someone. Like I'm not going to let that, I'm going to really, work to not let that alter my character in ways that pull me away from the fruit of the Spirit.
Yeah, and that is a tall order and a difficult thing, but you have this book where you're encouraging people. I have 2 more questions for you. And the first is, obviously the book is out. You've got the commandments out there. Are you getting different responses? And I don't want to get you in trouble here, but I am curious, from conservatives versus progressives. Are you seeing, what kind of reactions are you getting from the different perspectives and maybe even the people who might fall in those 4 different boxes that you mentioned?
Great. So far the response has been really positive, which has been great. And I think it speaks to, I think many of us have this perception, if you're out online, I don't know, if you're the dark world of Twitter or, Facebook, social media sometimes, like there's been these studies that have seen that, like the dominant voices and like, stuff on a lot of the social media platforms are dominated by the most extreme, like less than 10% on each side. So less than 10% on the left, less than 10% on the right. And I think there's actually a silent majority who are really frustrated with the polarization division, who have maybe whether more moderate or willing to work together and collaborate with people in different arenas, and so I think even though the impression for many of us is, man, it's just so extreme out there right now, I think the reality is there's a deep hunger that many people have for being able to come to the table together and have more mature, humble, constructive, fruitful conversations and all. And so far it seems like it's really struck a chord and been predominantly very positive response and feedback.
Yeah, no, and I love what you said about, remembering seeing people through the lens of how God sees them. I think one of the challenges, and you can speak to this if you want, but I think for me, when I look at what's happening right now, you do have a number of issues that are flammable issues, and that for Christians are issues that, and I'm talking social issues, are very important, right?
Yes.
And so when you have a cultural shift like we've had, and so something like abortion, which is a complex issue, Roe is gone. With Roe gone, there are a lot of new issues happening in 50 different states, but you have a much more distinct group of people who are speaking out, for abortion rights, right? Even more so than maybe before the transgender issue. You have these things that have become things that were sort of under the surface more, that are now very out in the open, eliciting
Yes.
emotion from people. And
Yes.
that's where as Christians, I think the struggle really comes in, because we feel very strongly on a lot of these issues. And how are you going to engage in a way that is constructive, as you're speaking about, and that doesn't cross a line or throw us predominantly into one of those buckets rather than leading with the gospel? Does that make sense?
No, it totally does. Yes. Well, one of the things that I've used at our church is we talk about, hey, taking a cue from the early church and 5 marks of the early church. And so there's been historians who have looked at the early church and seen how they modeled kind of this countercultural posture when it came to their presence, their civic presence in the world, right? And Larry Hurtado, a late historian, he noted 5 particular marks of the church. So the first he talks about is like multi-ethnic communities. So since like, man, people are coming to the table in an ancient world, like you ate with people who were like you by class, by ethnicity, by whatever. And he goes, it was radical and shocking that you had slave and free, Jew and Gentile, and all these different ethnicities and male and female coming together and feasting together around the table in Christ. This was this radical countercultural presence. Second one was care for the poor, how the Roman Empire, the emperors were like, oh my gosh, they're in a world with no social safety net, no social services. The church was caring for their poor and beyond. The third was a high sexual ethic, that Romans were famous for being kind of generous with their sex, so to speak, and stingy with their money, whereas the church was famous for the opposite of being stingy with their sex, like reserving sex for the marriage bed, but generous with their money and their finances. But there was a very high sexual ethic and sexual bar that was very countercultural. The fourth was pro-life with children, of going like, man, they stood against abortion. They actually cared for orphans. Infanticide was common, where infants would just be left out for
Exposure.
to
Yeah.
die. Totally.
Yeah.
Often females, because just the way it was, they would prefer a boy, and so they left female to die. And the church was famous for taking these children into their own homes and adopting and raising them so there's a sacrificial ethic on behalf of vulnerable children and the unborn. And the fifth was forgiveness and enemy love. Just going like, man, they prayed for their persecutors. They laid down their, even as they were being martyred, they responded with the love of Christ, because that was how Christ had treated them when we were his enemies. And I love how I once heard the late pastor Tim Keller make the observation of, man, if you're if you lean left, you tend to get excited about numbers 1 and 2, tend to be a little more suspicious when people start talking about numbers 3 and 4, right? If you lean right, you tend to get excited when we talk about 3 and 4, but can maybe be a little more suspicious at times of number 1 and 2. And nobody likes number 5, forgiveness and enemy love, right? And those are broad brushstrokes. Actually, obviously we're all over the place, but going as the body of Christ, as the church, that I think there's a countercultural presence that they call it to keep Christianity weird, in a sense, right? Of holding all 5 together at once and actually seeking to build an ethic and to participate in civic life in a means that is radically for all 5 of those. And I'm not saying it's only those 5, in the book we go into some other areas as well, but I think we need to stand with conviction on issues and areas where Christ is clear, where the gospel is clear, such as care for the unborn. I am very concerned about some of the impact of gender ideology today, particularly on youth, and the way that is having just a massive impact. I think there's massive concerns there. But I also think it's important that we not allow ourselves as the church to kind of be co-opted into one of those 4 quadrants, one of those 4 boxes, but we actually fight to have a countercultural presence where I kind of ask the question, man, of those 4 values, which quadrant is Jesus in? Where does Jesus belong? Progress, responsibility, identity, security. And my claim is Jesus doesn't belong to one of those 4 quadrants. Those 4 values belong to Jesus. He is the Lord of all of life. He is the Lord who holds together all those things and calls us into a countercultural presence that can take bold stands, but is not conformed or confined to some of the partisan boxes of our day.
Yeah. Well, I so appreciate you. I kept you for a very long time because this has been a really interesting conversation.
Great.
But the book is The Party Crasher: How Jesus Disrupts Politics as Usual and Redeems Our Partisan Divide. Appreciate you taking the time and joining us today.
Thanks, Billy. Love the conversation. Appreciate it, man. Thank you.